where we wanted to go.
They always had us marked for like knowing more than we were even involved in. I mean, we were doing what we were doing. We were doing a lesbian feminist newspaper, as it said right across the masthead. But no doubt in those days that made no sense to them whatsoever. So they figured it was a front for something else. I have no idea, but in those days the FBI was not necessarily accurate.
They thought it was a front.
No, it's real.
Okay, I'm here with you.
Good evening and welcome. I'm going to ask everybody to take a moment to put your microphone on mute as we start to move through this. I could mute all. That actually might be helpful at this moment, and then I'll unmute myself. Oh, and it did not even mute me. I just magically muted everyone. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We have a great evening planned with the film director, Jacqueline Rhodes, about her new film, Once a Fury. My comrade Max is putting more information about the film into the chat. I'm assuming many of you are here because you've already watched it online. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Julie Enzer. I am the editor and publisher of Sinister Wisdom, and I'm so excited to be here this evening with you for this event. As we begin, I want to acknowledge that we are all situated in different places, and almost all of us on occupied, unceded land that is historically not ours. I am in what is now Dover, Florida, traditional homelands and territories of the Seminole, as well as the Calusa and Tacobaga. I'd like us all to collectively pause this evening to recognize the histories of war and colonization, and to imagine and work for a world where we all have a fair and equitable distribution of resources. Also, shortly before we began this event, I received an email, and I'd like to invite us to remember the Sinister Wisdom subscriber and radical lesbian feminist activist Peggy Lures from Burlington, Vermont. She passed away this morning at 4:40 a.m., according to the information I have received, and was well loved and respected by women in the community. May her memory be a blessing to all who knew her and to all of us in this beloved community. So we have a full hour planned for you. As I do introductions, please feel free to do introductions in the chat. Tell us where you're located, what occupied land you are living on, and what you're looking forward to this evening. We'd be delighted to read it. We do have a full hour planned. We're going to wrap up, as we usually do, around 8 p.m. on the East Coast, including time for our traditional dance number at the end. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with Sinister Wisdom. Sinister Wisdom is a quarterly journal of lesbian literature and arts. If you are not a subscriber, please sign up tonight, sinisterwisdom.org/subscribe. Also, if you are not receiving the emails for some reason, or know someone not receiving the emails, do send me your email address and I will make sure you get added to the list. I am julie@sinisterwisdom.org. I always share that a group of monthly sustainers are vital to our work. If you are able to give $3, $5, or maybe even $100 a month to Sinister Wisdom, you can sign up to be a sustainer at sinisterwisdom.org/sustainers. I send emails every month when sustainer gifts arrive with behind the scenes details and new information about what we have coming for the journal. It forces me to always be doing something new and interesting every month to write it in that email. Being a sustainer is a great way to support Sinister Wisdom. On behalf of our entire board of directors and myself, I appreciate the many ways that lesbians lift up and support the work of Sinister Wisdom, including many people with us this evening. Thank you. So as we begin, a few housekeeping notes. I've muted everyone's microphone, and please keep yourself muted throughout the program. If we detect noise, we will mute you. There's opportunities for questions as we go through the program this evening, and you'll be able to wave and cheer and dance at the end, as you always do. As we go forward, if you want to show appreciation for the discussion and particular comments, you can use the reaction emojis on Zoom. Feel free to test them out now. Also, as I've said, feel free to light up the chat on Zoom. I'll monitor the chat for questions to ask Jackie as we move forward. If you need technical assistance this evening, you can chat with Max Backer, who's on tap for any technical assistance and help. Finally, we are recording the event and we'll make it available starting tomorrow or Thursday at sinisterwisdom.org/SW123. Max is putting that URL into the chat as we go. Now on to our program. I am so pleased to introduce Jacqueline R. Rhodes, also known as Jackie. Jackie is a professor in the Department of Rhetoric and Writing at the University of Texas at Austin. Her work extends from scholarly research to multimedia installations, to video, to poetry, focusing on the evocative intersections of embodiment, sexuality, and technologies. She is the author or co-author editor of 5 books, including the award-winning On Multimodalities, New Media in Composition Studies, and Techne, Queer Meditations on Writing the Self. And this new film that we're here to talk about this evening, Once a Fury, is a documentary that profiles a lesbian separatist collective from the early 1970s. So please join me in welcoming Jackie this evening for this fantastic conversation. And Jackie, I'd like you to just start out and tell us why the Furies.
I knew you were going to ask that, and I thought, well, why not? The Furies, for me, are foundational to my identity as a lesbian feminist, as a thinker. I tell a little bit of the story in the film. But when I came out in 1984, I was in small town Western Montana, and I had just gone to college. And I came out into a community of lesbians that was older than I was. They were all about 10 to 12 years older than me. And I got basically enculturated into lesbian life. I was told, here are some newspapers, read them. Here's some music, listen to it. Here are some books, read these. And so I'm always sort of a throwback to that time because like I said, it's foundational. This is who I am. And one of those instances was my girlfriend at the time, Nancy, had this box of Furies newspapers. And she said, you have to read these. You have to read these. And I read them. And, you know, in the 80s, they were still absolutely relevant. The discussions were absolutely crucial. Just as now when I read them 50 years from the time they were written, I think this is still relevant, absolutely. And I think that as I went on to write my dissertation on radical feminism and write my first book on radical feminism, I always intended on coming back to the Furies. That was going to be my second book, and it turned into a movie instead.
That's fantastic. And what a movie it is. So tell us, I want to get a little bit behind the scenes of making of the film. So first tell us, like, was it hard to set up the interviews? You interviewed not all, but very close to all of the original Furies. How did that proceed?
You know, it was some of the Furies, some of the former Furies are relatively easy to find because they have a public footprint. So Charlotte Bunch, who is a professor, I was able to track down. And so I emailed her. And then others, I had to do a little bit of scouring the internet to see mentions. Where are people? And I have to call out, I see Sharon Deavy here. Hi, Sharon. I found Sharon, who is one of the original Furies, because somebody's blog mentioned her work in radical nursing. And so I emailed the blogger to say, can you please pass this message on to Sharon because I want to do this project. And so it was everything from, finding Charlotte relatively easily to sort of tracking Sharon down. But I found that all of the Furies were willing to connect me with other Furies. So I would find one and then they would pass the note along to somebody else. And so it wasn't difficult because they were very generous. They were very generous with their time. And that was sort of a surprise to me because I thought, I'm just coming out of nowhere. I'm a stranger. And I sent, here's my CV, here's some of my work, and here's what my project's going to be. Please talk to me. And I don't know if I really needed to do all that. They were just, as I said, they were just so generous with their time.
That's great. That's great. And how did you make that decision to change your focus from a book, which is the medium that you've worked in before, to a film?
Well, I got writer's block for about 10 years. Maybe it was 15. It was a long block. It was really bad. I had this idea. I presented it at conferences. I had an abstract and I was going to conferences like the National Women's Studies Association conference and talking about the Furies and their newspaper in particular. I was focusing on the print culture aspect. And I thought, this is going to be the book. And then I would go to the archives. I went to Duke and saw the copies of the newspaper there. I poked around online because some of it's been digitized in a number of places. And I just never could write the book. It just wouldn't come out. And I wrote other books in the meantime. I wrote other articles. So it wasn't that I was stuck on writing. It was that this subject, for some reason, wasn't lending itself to a book. And then there was this moment, the aha moment of, eureka. It's like, it's 50 years later. The Furies, for the most part, are still alive. I mean, Susan Hathaway passed, unfortunately, but the Furies are still alive. You could talk to them. And that was just this aha, like, oh my goodness, I could. Wouldn't that be amazing to talk to these people who wrote this newspaper and published this newspaper and were so formative in my thinking? And so once that happened, the floodgates were released on getting this done. I worked for putting together an independent film, worked relatively quickly. The whole process took about 3 years once I got going. But before that was 10 years of research.
Great. And I always ask the taboo question about money, thinking that it costs a lot more to make a film than to write a book. Can you talk to us a little bit about how much money it costs to make the film and how you financed it?
Yeah, it actually does cost a lot more money to make a film than to write an academic book, especially. Yeah, I would say it ends up coming in at about $15,000 to $20,000. Now, I had a grant from my institution at the time, which was Michigan State University, gave me a development grant that I got to pay for rights to different Getty images that I used and to some of the music that I got through a Creative Commons license or had to pay a little bit for. The main theme music actually was my brother, who I also paid because I believe in paying people for their labor. But the other stuff was flying, because I was flying to California 3 times. I flew to Santa Fe and stayed there. I flew to New York City and took, and to Washington, D.C., and took along my teaching assistant to run cameras for me. And so there are a lot of costs that had to do with just getting to the interviews and doing the interviews. And then the grant also paid for some of the post-production. But yeah, I would say probably about 20,000 all told. And some of it was just personal, instead of going to that conference, I would sock away a few $100 to pay for this. So I didn't go to a lot of conferences during that time. But yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. A friend of mine always talks about the different interviews he's done on his tax return trips. He's like, oh yes, that was the 1993 tax return where I interviewed that person.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What surprised you in the research? I mean, you talk in the film about this long-term connection to reading the newspaper of the Furies. And I think you were writing and thinking about it for so long, but were there some surprises that came out in the process of making the film?
Yeah, it's a hard question because I went like a good oral historian with my list of questions and deviated from those questions all the time because you want the conversation to just go where it's going. And so I would say each interview would have some surprise in it because I wasn't prepared for someone to talk about when Helene Harris was talking about how the first issue was, or not the first issue, but the issues ended up being published by Army Times in DC. I thought, well, I didn't know that. Or I think, Sharon, you mentioned going down to Atlanta in a beat up old van and taking the specs with you to get it printed up because nobody would print this thing. And so hearing just these details was a surprise because it's not in the newspaper itself. It's not in the written record. It's not necessarily in somebody's memoir, but it was in these stories. And that's why it's so important to talk to people and hear those stories. I learned a lot about asking questions, and I learned even more about listening more carefully because as you're interviewing, especially if you plan on using it in film, you have to train yourself to shut up. And normally when you're talking, you would go, yeah, but that just interferes with the film. So I would have to just sort of sit there while people talked and nod. And there were a couple of times when it was going off in a really interesting direction. This is during some of the first interviews. It's like, wow, the stories are going in a great direction, but oh no, I have these questions I have to ask. And I yanked back to the questions and I've kicked myself for that ever since then. And that one story that Sharon was telling about going to Atlanta was one of those instances where she had just mentioned it and I was like, wow, that's really interesting. And then boop, I have a question I have to ask. And I've kicked myself ever since then. So I learned over the course of doing this because Sharon was my very first interview for the movie. I learned over the course of it to shut up, to ignore my questions, at least in terms of a rule, because those questions were going to be answered. So I guess the surprise has more to do with the process of conversation. There are a lot of really intriguing details that come up, most of which I managed to get into the movie, but an awful lot that ended up edited out.
Oh, well, tell us, that was my next question. Give us a couple juicy bits that didn't make it, that are on the cutting room floor that we might all like to hear about.
Oh my goodness. When I did the very first cut of this film, it was all about origin stories. Where did people come from? How did they end up in Washington, D.C. all at the same time? And that has disappeared from the movie, except for in the very first part where it's like, well, they came from here and they came from here and they came from here. But in the stories themselves, you'll hear Tasha talking about going to the trial of the Chicago 7 and some of what happened at the trial of the Chicago 7, because Tasha's father was on trial. He was one of the Chicago 7. And you'll hear these other stories of, I'm thinking of, well, if you've read Ginny Burson's memoir, you will have heard some of this, but, getting to Washington, D.C. and then leaving to found Olivia Records, there were all of these stories about traversing the U.S. That are just gone. There just wasn't room for them in the movie. So I'm not sure if there are juicy bits. I mean, I would say, of course there are juicy bits. They're great stories. And this might be a surprise. Everybody was a good storyteller. Everybody was a good storyteller. This made me think this is what I want to do instead of write academic books, because now I can listen to people tell stories. And trying to, when you talk to Ginny about Olivia Records, fascinating stuff. If you talk to her about what she was doing in the Peace Corps before that, fascinating stuff. If you talk to Sharon about all of her work that she's done with radical nursing since then, and we talked a lot about the future, and the future doesn't show up in the movie so much.
Yeah. Rose Norman asked, noted that the film doesn't say much about who the women were who became the Furies,
Yeah.
and wondered, was that on purpose or did it get edited out? And how could you talk a little bit about how you made that choice to drop that?
It was a really hard choice because, as I said, the very first draft did a lot of that because I found that part of the story so fascinating. How do you find these women who are so interesting, well-read, who are writers, who are political thinkers? How does such a combination end up in the same place in this flashpoint in time? And so the very first cut had people telling stories for like 20, 25 minutes. And that was one that I showed to not, I ended up showing that to the Furies, but I also was showing it to some of my other people. And they said, but what happens? But what happens? What's the center of your story? What do you want to tell? And it was a rough decision because there's so much of that story that needs to be told. So I'll say, it ended up on the cutting room floor, but the next part of this is I'm planning on taking all of the 19 hours of footage and cleaning it up and then donating it to a library so that researchers can see the full interviews. So it's not lost. It's just when you're making those sort of genre considerations for a movie, something needs to happen. It needs to have some sort of arc, and you only have, an hour, a little over an hour to tell that story. So it got focused, and yeah, it was rough. I felt sad about that because it was just like, okay, delete.
Yeah. I think one of the other things that I find so interesting in thinking about this time period, both in relationship to the Furies, but the women's liberation movement overall, is how to capture the sense of excitement and possibility and the kind of vibrancy that everyone felt at that time about being on the precipice of change and sort of evoking not only people's belief in change that sort of brought people together to start the Furies, but also evoking the broader environment. Can you talk a little bit about how you think about this period of the early 1970s?
Yeah, in my dark times now, because things just seem to be going to hell in a handbasket these days, I ask people, my friends who are in their 60s and 70s, and I ask them, is it different? What is different? And a number of them have said, we had hope. We had hope. And when I feel hell in a handbasket these days, it's because of that lack of hope. And that's part of what I'm trying to get back to by listening to stories of people who also were living in very hard times, very hard times. So yeah, the hope and the actual belief we can change the world. So when the Furies are writing in their newspaper, they're conveying their ideology and talking about, we need to do this, we need to believe this, we need to think about this. It wasn't we need to do this because we're just going to sit around and talk about it. It was like, no, we're going to go out and do this. We're not sure exactly how entirely yet, but it needs to happen. And there was that belief in the Furies and other groups that change could happen. And I think that's probably the central thing to remember for me, is that none of this was idle chatter. There was a lot of friction between different feminist groups and a lot of different lesbian feminist groups about which way we would go about causing the revolution or leading the revolution. But there wasn't a doubt that the revolution was going to happen.
Yeah. And I think that kind of conflict gets at the next thing that I wanted to lift up about the film and hear you reflect on a bit. I think that just as much as your investment in showing the hope and the vitality of the time, you also are really willing to look at the difficult feelings, the painful moments, the sadnesses and the regrets that people had, that they recounted both experiencing in the moment and a little bit retrospectively as well in the film. In particular, we had a question on the chat from Batya. Did you talk about the children that they gave away? And you did address that issue. So I wonder if you could talk about the painful, difficult things that come up in this film and your decision for how to weave them into this story.
Yeah, that emerged from the interviews themselves, that issue. And I'm hesitant with the phrasing, gave the children away, because that implies a lack of care. And this was an extraordinarily difficult decision made by some, and an extraordinarily difficult time, because sometimes the decision was made by the collective and not by the individuals. So with all of that, that is something that is not necessarily in the newspaper, and it's not in memoirs necessarily, but it came from the interviews, and that became one of the central conflicts that shows up in the movie, because it was one of the central conflicts that I think led to the demise of the group. And I think that Helene in there says something about, once that happened, things changed. We started seeing each other as enemies instead of somebody else as an enemy. Or when Jenna says, I was just done with it after that. I had just done with it. So it was very difficult at the time. It's still extraordinarily difficult 50 years later, of course, extraordinarily difficult. And I think that that was one of the things that helped me a lot to put that in the film, was that I circulated drafts of this film to the Furies over and over and over again, and they watched it and offered feedback and were very careful. They really tried hard to make sure that some sort of objective truth, if such a thing is possible, came forward, more a holistic truth that sort of looks at the complications of that issue. So they would write me notes that show up in the movie. They would write me emails that show up in the movie just to correct or change something or add a little something to the story. And that helped, because they helped me write that story. It's a difficult story. I will say, what's interesting to me looking back on those choices is that it wasn't necessarily the case that you would ask a male revolutionary what he was doing with his kids. Mm-hmm. And looking back on those choices now, very often people are looking, what did the women revolutionaries do in terms of childcare? And it's like, why do we assume that that's their role? Right? So it's more a great, that's a theoretical question to debate. The less theoretical is just, what are the consequences of making decisions like that when you're so committed to the revolution that you would make a personal decision that hurts you, It was difficult.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that difficulty and the way that decision was so fraught comes through in the film, almost as if you're experiencing, even without knowing all of the different opinions that people had, you're still experiencing the tension and the pain as you watch the film.
Yeah. It was the other tension that comes up that I don't spend as much time on, but I think is an important tension, is the discussion of race. Mm-hmm. Because this is a group of white women, but they acknowledge this was a blind spot, that we talked about it. We were influenced by the Black Panthers. We worked with the Black Panthers, of course, because we're in Washington, D.C. doing dual action sometimes before the Furies started with the Black Panthers. Mm-hmm. But the group itself is a group of white women who had a great class analysis a great class analysis and rather less of a race analysis. And I think Ginny addresses that, and so does Kalita in the movie. There's that tension of, okay, when we look back now, 50 years back, we can say, oh yeah, that group should have done this, 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 and this. And it's like, yeah, but at the time, this is how it happened. This is how it happened. So looking back, can people contextualize those decisions that they made, whether it's about doing more analysis having to do with the intersections of race and class in the Furies, or having to do with who's doing childcare, right? And I think one of the interesting discussions that came up that Ginny mentioned, and I think Rita May does too, is the real fear of violence. The real fear of violence. Ginny will say, you know, we were supposed to be running around the country starting up cells. How could we possibly take care of children? So that's part of it. That's one story. The other story is more, how do we continue doing this commitment to the revolution, whether or not it's violent, and spend time on childcare? And there's some discussion even in the movie. Of course, we should have. Kalita said, how could we dismiss this next generation? But this is retrospect. It's retrospect. And I think this is one of the things I still like about the movie, is that you can see people who made a decision in their 20s or earlier, and they've thought about it for 50 years. And of course, there are regrets. And of course, there are different stories. So what I was trying to do is convey some of the complication of the entire issue.
So another thing that I wanted to ask you a bit about is how making this film and researching the Furies has shaped your thinking about separatism, both at the time of the Furies and today.
At the time, I mean, not just separatism, lesbian separatism.
Lesbian separatism.
Because you have Cell 16. Cell 16 was not a lesbian group, but it was a separatist group, right? So the idea of separatism, I think at the time was absolutely important to back up out of mainstream feminism and the New Left and gather your resources, intellectual, emotional, financial, whatever, with a group of people who share your politics, who share identities for the most part, to sort of withdraw, gather your resources, and then go back out for the fight. And I think that even in the Furies newspaper, you have Charlotte writing about sort of the end of separatism, right? Because she renounces it in the journal itself toward the end. And yeah, as a point of political operation, I think it's very important in the late 60s, early 70s. I'm not sure to what extent it's well, of course it's possible. It's still happening. It's still happening. There's still women's land. There's still separatist places. But it's different in terms of, with the Furies, that political ideology attached to the separatism that has a very public venue, right? The newspaper. So yeah, I'm not quite making the connection. It's connected in my head somehow between the separatism and the newspaper. There's something about political ideology, living it, and then making something that goes with it that was very key to 60s and 70s activism, which is why you see so many newspapers and journals and manifestos emerging at that time. So yeah, I'd still say, of course, there's a place for separatism now, because of course it's still going on. I'm not sure if it's possible to separate in the same way, and I'm going to blame the interweb for that.
Oh, interesting.
It's a print culture thing, right? It's very hard to sort of center yourself when you have this constant barrage of information coming at you.
Although the other sort of flip side of that, and the sort of Cass Sunstein theorists of the world would say, actually, the internet has facilitated a lot more separatist communities. Like, they're all over the place, and we're in our own little separatist communities, only talking to people who we agree with.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah. I'd also say one of the things that is great about internet stuff, there is a piece in Bell Hooks's early work on feminist theory from margin to center, where she talks about literacy as a feminist action.
Mhm.
And she's basing a lot of what she's saying on, you know, at the time, and she wrote this in the 80s, I believe.
1984.
That's right.
Mhm.
Newspapers are very expensive. Radio is expensive. TV is expensive. But if you can publish your own newspaper, or if you have mimeographs or posters and manifestos that you can pass out, you are going to reach an audience. But it's important that audience can read and write what you're getting to them.
Mhm.
And that's not just a matter of functional literacy, of being able to read and write, but having access to the tools of literacy. So I think that now, theoretically at least, if you have access, this is the big question for internet activism. If you have access to the internet, then you can spread the word. You can spread your ideology in ways that you couldn't have 50 years ago.
Mhm. Mhm. Interesting. Well, we could have I could take us in a whole other direction.
I know, because, you know,
like, I want to talk about QAnon now and all kinds of things, but I'm not going to go there. I'm going to go, Sue Goldwoman had a series of questions here that are about the Furies. I'm going to gang them all together and read them to you, and then you can pick and choose what you respond to. Sue wrote, "Loved the movie and had lots of questions after seeing it. Do the former Furies still get together ever?" I kind of think of this question as like, are they secretly getting together, planning the revolution even today? What, if anything, would any of the Furies do differently if they were organizing today? There is lots the Furies went on to do, but the movie isn't clear on what they all ended up doing, either right after they left and or still active now. What are they doing today?
Mhm.
So lots of dense questions in there. If you could unpack what you know.
Yeah. What was the very first one? The very first
Do the
one.
former Furies ever still get
Oh, yeah,
together?
No, not as a group, as far as I know. I think that different members of the Furies are still friends with each other. I know some of them still talk on the phone with each other. I know that some of them started talking with each other because of their interest in the film,
Mhm.
in their interest in the film getting it right. So it wasn't in the interest in the film, it was, is it going to get it right? And so they sort of traded notes on what was wrong, what was right, things like that, which was great. It made the process of making the film, I think, a much more feminist and less hierarchical documentary, in that it's not just my voice telling their story, it's their voices telling their story. There was a reunion, I don't remember what year it was. There was a reunion at a women's studies conference that somebody organized that got some of the members of the Furies together. But yeah, it's not like they're holding Furies reunions every 10 years. You know, people went in very different directions in some ways, and very similar activist directions in others. So you have Sharon, who did all of her work, got her PhD in nursing, does radical nurse stuff, you have Ginny, who is still organizing.
Mhm.
You have Helene Harris, who went on to found Women in Distribution and worked at Daedalus for a very long time. And now I believe is running a very large farmers market in Delaware, right? So there's still all of this activist work going on. And I think it's amazing to me, because it's that constant energy. We need to change the world. We need to make it a better place. And they're still all doing that. But, the future of the Furies is another part that ended up on the cutting room floor. This is really just a slice of, here they are. They made here they are, they got together, they made their newspaper, and then they split. It's the juicy chapter.
Yeah.
And some of the other questions, I mean, a lot of them, I think the Furies themselves would have to answer. But what were some of the other questions?
I think you addressed a
I
good chunk
caught
of
a
them.
few of those, yeah.
Yeah. And, Sharon's here, maybe Sharon, I'll just put it out there. We could do a Furies reunion through Sinister Wisdom, should that be something people were interested in. I'll just mention that briefly. Someone had a great question. Someone made has a great question about the word revolution. Leslie writes, I'm having a problem with the word revolution. I was born in 1960, so I was 12 in 1972 and unable to envision change beyond a neighborhood. How did they, I'm assuming she means the Furies, envision the manifestation of the revolution?
Oh, yeah. The idea was that different arms of the revolution would have a vanguard, and those vanguards would get together and spearhead sort of this massive revolution, right? So you have the Black Panthers as one vanguard and the Furies seeing themselves as another vanguard. So you'd have different vanguards. So whether or not that would have worked, well, it didn't, that revolution didn't happen that way. The Furies actually had plans. And I saw notes about this because Charlotte Bunch still has notes from their meetings. Like she took minutes and they're still there in a box. And the idea was we're going to start cells around the country and that there will be a leader of these cells. And it's going to start with reading the newspaper, getting up on the ideology, being able to go out and convert more, right? Well, that didn't happen in that way. Although the newspaper had a national run, it had something like 5,000 subscribers. And when I looked at them, in some of them at Duke, they all have handwritten notes in them. And people took these newspapers very seriously as the ways of raising, I don't want to say consciousness raising because that's a different thing right at that point. But to get together and study. This is how we're going to make a revolution. So the idea was to have a national revolution. And it was going to be through collaborating with other groups. Now, Ginny in the movie says, well, we didn't really know how to do that, but that was the plan, right? That was the plan. And who knows, if it had lasted another year or two, who knows?
Right. Right. And I'll just also, I just want to note and kind of lift up from the chat that Carol wrote a great comment that I have just lost about the many organizations that women in the Furies went on to found. Oh, here it is.
Yes.
The times after the collective ended, these 12 women went on to found in the next few years, and this is just primarily in the 1970s, Diana Press, Quest, Women in Distribution, Olivia Records, Jeb's Photo Documentation and later Film Production Company. And then I'll add, like, if you continue to trace their activist work through the 80s, 90s, up till today, as you mentioned, Jackie, they continue to be deeply involved in community-based organizing and change efforts.
Right. And I think it gets to that to some little extent at the end of the film, where I'm saying they went on to make photographs, to create art, to write novels. Diana Press is in there. Kalita founded Diana Press with others. All of that work is foundational to any understanding of lesbian feminism in the US. Probably beyond, but I'll stay within the US for now. Any understanding of lesbian feminism in the US has to take into account the Furies and what they did immediately after the collective disbanded.
Now we have a big, and I've lost the person who asked it, but, and I hope I'm remembering it right. Someone asked for the difference. Oh, Sherry did. Sherry's on Rosenthal said, can someone, and I'm going to put the question to you, Jackie, because you're the someone of our hour, compare and contrast red stockings and the Furies. And you can decline on that, but it's such a great
I might
question.
mostly decline on that, although the Red Stockings, I love the Red Stockings manifesto. I mean, the manifesto writing movements this is the late 60s. Let's see, Red Stockings, did that come out of New York City? I believe it came out of New York.
New York,
right?
Yeah.
Came out of New York. You have the New York Radical Feminists, you have Firestone, you have all of these people organizing in Chicago and New York and writing manifestos and doing it as this matter of keeping people together, not necessarily separate or separatist, but keeping the movement alive. It's interesting to compare them as groups. I don't know as much about the Red Stockings as a group, except I don't think that the Red Stockings were a group in the same sense that the Furies were. And that the Furies lasted longer, for one thing. I think the Red Stockings came together to write the manifesto. The Furies newspaper itself contains all sorts of manifesto-like writing. It's essentially a narrative manifesto. So I'm going to decline sort of on that because I think it's not apples and oranges. The Red Stockings were not lesbian separatists, but radical feminists, certainly. And frequently anthologized and very interesting. And if there's anybody out there who hasn't read it lately, also still relevant.
Mm-hmm. And I think part of why I lifted up that question is also it opens up this kind of question. I mean, this film is such a gift to our understanding of the Furies. And I feel like there's still so much that we can be writing and thinking and making films about from lesbian feminist history. And I wonder if there are some particular areas that you want to direct people's attention to. This is always my favorite thing to do. Like, this is really interesting. I won't be doing this work, but you could. Do you have any items like that, Jackie?
You know, before I did this movie, my original documentary idea was this. I was going to take a sabbatical and I was going to live on the land, on women's land, and do a documentary about my time there. Because I think that women's land is important in all of its complications. And I think that there's a great film to be made there. At the same time, I think that there's a lot of women's land that the women living there wouldn't necessarily want somebody showing up with their camera, right? So, and we talked about this a little bit. So there's the, I just lost it. Susan B. Anthony Memorial Unrest
Home, yes, in Ohio.
In Ohio, that is now a 503c(b). And I thought, well, maybe there. But yeah, I had this idea of looking at women's land in particular because I had Joyce Chaney's book, Lesbian Land, which profiles a bunch of different collectives on the land, some of which had already broken apart, some of which were about to break apart, some of which were still going strong. And this was also written in the 80s. And also part of that package of here, you're going to be a lesbian when you read all of this. It's like, okay, I'm cultured now. So I read Lesbian Land, and my first idea was I'm going to track down every one of these and see what happened.
Mm.
And then I'm going to find more lesbian land, women's land. And then the culmination of that is going to be a sabbatical where I'm living on it. Now that has not disappeared yet as an idea.
Like, you still have time.
I still have time.
Yes. Yes. And you can, I'll just say, Sinister Wisdom, we have copies of Lesbian Land that we sell. And the lesbian feminist activist, the Southern Lesbian Feminist Activist Oral History Project, which I'm still waiting for the great acronym for, updated large parts of Joyce Chaney's book. Did I get the name right? Yeah. Joyce. I'm sorry, I was reading in the chat. In the chat. But the Sinister Wisdom 98 updated lots of what's going on in Southern lesbian land. So I wanted to do that little plug.
Yeah, Joyce Chaney, that came out from, I think she was in Minnesota at the time, but yeah. So tell us a little bit about what's next for this film. Some people in the chat were asking how to see it.
So we've been dropping in links for that, but tell us a little bit about what's next in this film's journey.
Well, it's been playing in festivals for the last year, which means its festival run is probably pretty much over, right? But it is streaming. It's on tellotv.com. And I always tell people, if you want to see it, you have to subscribe for $6. So you subscribe, you watch it, you unsubscribe. Not that I want to interfere with Tello's marketing, but that's one way. What's next for it is I'm trying to get a distribution deal to start marketing the DVDs or the streaming rights to it so people can just buy it and have it. And that is tricky. Everybody wants a distribution deal. So I have feelers out to a couple of places. I also am presenting it at different universities at times. So I will have local LGBTQ plus people say, we'd love to show your movie. And I say, sure. Because I really, when you asked the money question, I thought, well, it's funny because this is not a movie that will ever make money. It just won't. And that was not my intent with it at all. It is, and I told the Furies this when I was interviewing them, it is a labor of love. It really is a labor of love and respect and honoring our elders and their voices. So if I can get it to universities, if I can get it to community groups, if you want me to come to your group and show it, I'm happy to do it. The only thing that Tello Film says I can't do is I can't stream it on TV. Because I asked them before I entered it into some more festivals, but is festival run okay? And they're like, yeah, it's fine. As long as you're not directly interfering with Tello TV's audience. So yeah. If you want it, just contact me. If you go to my website, or actually, I think the movie website has an email link too. Just email me. I'm very flexible with it.
Great. Someone asked the question, how did you have technical skills before you started making this film? Like how, were you like secretly, did you have a secret passion of, editing the family films and videos?
No,
or
I decided, I decided when I was 14 that I was going to be a director, and then I gave it up for 40 years. I had my little Super 8 camera and I would make fake commercials sort of like Saturday Night Live did. And I would do that. So I had, I would play with cameras, but, I play with computers, I play with cameras. I'm a tinkerer. And so I like the technology. I do things like multimedia installations. So I'm familiar with a lot of the software. But there's still, making a feature film, they're still getting things down like, how do you run lights? How do you set up the lights? How do you keep the refrigerator from humming underneath all the things? How do you get all of these different little techie things? So it was a learning process as we went along. Now to reference back to that first interview with Sharon was within driving distance. So I took a car full of equipment with me, and we had everything from little recorders to big softbox lights to tables. And it was just like this whole set. And I thought, well, this is really luxurious. This is great. And then when I started flying and I had to take it on planes, and I was so worried about them breaking or losing or getting my equipment stolen that I was taking anything I could carry on. My Go pack for movies got very much smaller after that. So I have a lot of equipment that was just for Sharon's interview and nobody else's. But yeah, it's a learning process. It's learning.
But it sounds like people with some interest and curiosity and a small budget are able to do it.
Oh yeah, and lots of curiosity and lots of patience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's great. So Jackie, what's next? What's next for you?
I am working on a series of short films actually right now, and I'm calling it a song cycle. It's based on old classical song cycles where you listen to a song and it makes sense in itself, but you have to listen to the entire suite in order to get the full meaning. So I'm calling it a song cycle of films, and it's called I Am My Beloved's. And it's about family and friends and how they can tell your story better than you can. I'll leave it at that provocative little, I am my beloved's.
I Am My Beloved's, and we'll see it in 2 or 3 years.
I would guess the first short one will probably come out in the next year and a half. Yeah. So I'm working on that, and I still have that sabbatical idea.
Yeah, of going to the land.
of going to the land and filming there. Yes.
That's great. We had a question about, people were curious. You interviewed, I think, 10 of the 12 Furies.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Someone asked, what's the story on the 2 who were not interviewed?
One was Susan Hathaway, who is no longer with us. And the other was Lee Schwing, who I did not manage to track down until after the movie was completed. And that was by a side reference to a side reference to a side reference on Facebook. And I believe she had been out of the country.
Got it.
So, but everybody else, you have 9 of the Furies that I talked to on film, actually 10, because Jeb did not do an individual interview, but she was instrumental in getting the film done. You know, she licensed her work to me so I could use it in the film. She talked to me about editing. I mean, this is another way that you learn how to do stuff, is you find somebody else who's done it and let them mentor you. And so she was instrumental to the film, but chose not to be interviewed. But she shows up at the end with the plaque because she led that effort to get the Furies house put on the National Registry.
Yeah. And Jeb is just so extraordinarily generous in every way.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. All right. So I'm going to, I have a final juicy question, and I don't remember the reference. So I hope that you do. Sally writes that she'd like to hear Jackie's own assessment of Rita Mae Brown's point about violence, retrospective justification, or genuine diagnosis of likely outcomes. So if you would give a little synopsis of Rita Mae Brown's thing and your perception of it, and we're going to use this as the final wrap before we go into our song.
It's an interesting question, actually, because if you've ever talked with Rita Mae, she is such a raconteur. She is such a storyteller that it's hard to figure out what's the story and what's not the story. In the movie, she says something about being worried about violence, and that's why she was worried about the children being there. And she said something about, you know, none of the others are ready for violence, but I am. If somebody comes after me, I'll pick up a 2x4 or something like that. And I'm not sure. And I'm not trying to dodge that question. I think that, coupled with Ginny saying something about, you know, how are we supposed to take care of kids when we're doing all this other revolutionary stuff? I think that in retrospect, it might be justification for the decision. Mm-hmm. But who knows what went on 50 years ago in Rita Mae Brown's head? Rita Mae does.
Somewhere amidst all of the stories about it.
She is a great storyteller, and I think that she's told the stories before in her memoirs. And so I know that you can tell stories for a long time and then you start believing them even beyond their truth.
Jackie, thank you so much. This has been such a great pleasure to have this conversation. I know so many people in the Sinister Wisdom community appreciated seeing this film, appreciated your work to make it possible for us to see it. And so thank you. I invite everyone, we'll be back. Next month we have we're doing Sinister Wisdom is co-sponsoring a book party for a book that I am publishing with Rutgers University Press. You'll get more information on email about it. We have our Sinister Wisdom book club at the end of the month in March, and April brings us the launch of the new issue. So I hope to see all of you again for other events. Max is now going to put on the music. We'll spotlight your videos as you dance. When our song, the L word, ends, I will end the Zoom call. Thank you all so much. Max, take it away.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Reclaim our name and not live in shame to try to improve our lot. Come on and say the L word. It's the only chance you got to stop the lying and denying. And come on and give it a shot. And everybody say lesbian. Lesbian. Everybody say lesbian. Everybody say lesbian. Come on, say lesbian. Now, the last time you said the L word, did your stomach take a turn? Did you look around and see if the sound was loud enough to make the ears burn? Did you say it in a whisper, or did you just say gay? Did your face turn red? Did you decide instead to save it for another day? Then to yourself say lesbian. Everybody say lesbian. Come on, say lesbian. Everybody say lesbian.
We know there are risks involved. No oppressed group has ever gained their freedom without risk. And no oppressed group has ever gained their freedom without a visible movement. So right here, in broad daylight on the courthouse steps, we want to take this day to announce the official launching of the Fairness Campaign to work for fairness and justice for lesbians and gays, and to see that fairness is present in city
Do you
law.
think it sounds like a rare disease, a perversion, a plague, a vice? All it takes is a little practice. So come on and take my advice, and everybody say lesbian. Everybody say lesbian. Everybody say lesbian. Come on, say lesbian. Because if you can't say it, it's hard to be it. If you can't be it, they can't see it. If they can't see it, they'll deny it. If we all deny it, we're in the closet for life. For life. Or death. Silence equals death. Wrong.
Violence against lesbians and gays has increased every year since the start of the AIDS crisis. We still fear losing our jobs. We are denied places to live. We are here today to say enough is enough. We are ready to live as full and equal members of society, and we are ready to fight for our freedom.
So give me an
No
L.
war.
Give me an E. Give me an S. Give me a B. Give me an I. A. Everybody say lesbian. Come on, say lesbian. Everybody say lesbian.
Sherry and Lathan next to each other.
This is a significant time in our community and our visibility as a movement. We must be strong and proud and out.
The next time you say the L word, think of the woman next to you, or your teammate on the soccer field, or the wise one that's helping you through. Think of your high school
fun.
Thank you all so much. See you next time.
Big hug all around.